Hello and welcome to today's live stream. We are going to be running through all things to do with battery storage forecasting today. So Shaniyaa is going to take us through the key trends from 2024 before Robyn takes us through the latest version of the forecast that's just been released. That's V3.3. And then I'm going to be talking through a couple of things that might change in 2025 that might influence a little bit of how those forecast numbers look in the future. Throughout the course of the live stream, you can go onto the Q&A and ask questions. The Modo team is on hand to pick up some of those questions as we go. And if you ask something that's particularly good, we'll pick it up in the Q&A at the end. And if you're having any trouble with the audio, please do download the Zoom app. And I think the audio and video quality will be best through there. So with that all out of the way, let's get started. And I'm going to hand over to Shaniyaa.
Hi, I'm Shaniyaa, the market lead for Great Britain at Modo Energy. I'm going to walk you through updates to the BESS GB index and take a look at how revenues evolved throughout 2024. The BESS GB index provides a consistent and transparent way to measure revenue performance of utility-scale batteries in Great Britain. In 2024, battery energy storage systems in Great Britain earned an average of £50,000 per megawatt per year, a 23% reduction from 2023. But before we dive into what happened last year, let's take a look at two of the improvements we made to the BESS GB index last month. Our improved wholesale methodology now distinguishes between day-ahead and intraday trades using a battery's physical notification. The orange blocks show a consistent physical notification over an hour, which signals day-ahead trades. The blue blocks show varying physical notifications within the hour and a physical notification for a single half-hour period. These indicate intraday trades. By analyzing the shape of a battery's physical notifications, our new methodology provides insight into how a battery might navigate between day-ahead trading and intraday trading. This means it can capture potential revenue opportunities driven by significant price differences. This better reflects how batteries trade in reality. For example, on January 8th, 2025, the intraday price peaked at £1.8 thousand per megawatt hour. This was 5 times greater than the day-ahead price from the same period. The bars in orange show revenues based on our previous index methodology, assuming all trades follow day-ahead prices. These blue bars reflect our improved methodology and capture the additional value opportunity that was available from trading in the intraday market. This improvement resulted in a 450% increase in wholesale revenue for this battery on this day, better representing the dynamic trading behavior of batteries between day-ahead and intraday markets. Imbalance payments have also been added to the index. This is calculated by multiplying the system price by the battery's imbalance volume. A battery's imbalance volume is the difference between its reported physical notification and its metered data. For example, a battery reports through its physical notification that it will sell, in other words, export, 50 megawatt hours of energy. During the same settlement period, it imports 10 megawatt hours as instructed in the balancer mechanism, and 2 megawatt hours from providing dynamic regulation high. As these services help stabilize the grid, they are excluded from the imbalance calculation. Its metered data shows that the battery exported 35 megawatt hours, meaning the battery still under-delivered by 3 megawatt hours. This remaining volume is charged at the system price to calculate the imbalance payment. You can find out more about these improvements and other improvements to our index methodology in the dedicated article on the Modo terminal. The BESS GB index captures the revenue performance of batteries that are registered as balancing mechanism units, also known as BMUs. At the start of 2024, commercially operational battery capacity in Great Britain was 3.7 gigawatts, with 2.6 gigawatts of this capacity registered as BMUs, as shown on the graph in blue. By the end of 2024, total capacity rose to 4.7 gigawatts, with 3.3 gigawatts as BMUs. Most of the increased BMU capacity in 2024 came from new batteries. with 80 megawatts added from existing batteries registering for the balancing mechanism. 7 units, however, deregistered during the year. Battery duration and energy capacity have become increasingly important as batteries focus more on energy trading than ancillary services. By the end of 2024, total grid-scale battery energy capacity reached 6.6 gigawatt hours, driven by new batteries and capacity upgrades at several Gresham House sites. So, how did batteries perform in 2024? On average, batteries earned £50,000 per megawatt per year, with revenues fluctuating throughout the year but steadily increasing. Splitting the index by market gives an understanding of which revenue streams batteries operated in. The capacity market, shown in blue, provided batteries a revenue of £11,000 per megawatt per year. In early 2024, revenues were at their lowest ever due to low wholesale price volatility last winter. Balancing Reserve, which launched in March, was the first reserve service to be introduced in 2024. It provided a small boost to revenues. From April to October, battery revenues were strongly linked to wind generation, as negative prices provided the best trading opportunities. By the end of the year, battery revenues were driven by wholesale price spikes caused by tight power margins. In December, batteries earned their highest monthly revenue since January 2023 as wholesale prices reached a 2-year high. This was also coupled with the launch of the Quick Reserve service, which provided an additional income stream to help boost battery revenues. So, the key takeaways from 2024 were: we saw 2 new reserve services introduced throughout the year, providing a revenue uplift for batteries. We saw the introduction of new pricing dynamics with negative prices during periods of excess power driven by high wind generation, as well as the return of scarcity pricing on cold, still days. Now that we know how revenues and markets looked in 2024, I'll hand you over to Robyn and Ed as they talk you through how these are set to evolve in the future.
Thank you, Shaniyaa, for that run through of 2024. Now I'm going to be passing over to Robyn to go through forecast version 3.3.
Thank you, Ed. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So I'm Robyn Lucas. I head up the forecasting team here at Modo. We put out our GB revenue curves. So the highlight for version 3.3, which is now available on our terminal, is that we have a completely new way of forecasting intraday revenues for batteries. Now, why is this interesting? So the intraday markets represent a different way to optimize your batteries closer to delivery. So in addition to the more traditional day ahead, wholesale or frequency response markets, intraday prices can change quite a lot up to the delivery period as renewable forecasts, demand forecasts, thermal outages, etc., can impact how the market is operating. And they have traditionally been quite difficult to model. It's a very dynamic market because things change all the time. So in your EPEX continuous market, where most of the volume is traded between about 1 and 4 hours out from delivery, you get many, many different prices. It's an open order book. So a lot of trading desks will be responding live in real time to the opportunities that they see in front of them on the screens. So how do you model this as part of a long-term forecast? Traditionally, people might use a percentage uplift on day-ahead only merchant revenues, and there will be some assumptions or historic analysis behind those percentage uplifts. But what we've done in the latest version of the forecast is really look at the data coming out of the intraday markets and come up with a completely different way of dealing with these markets in our revenue forecast. So we now have a specific price forecast for intraday markets, and that's representing the volume-weighted average price of the EPEX continuous market, or the EPEX RPD half-hourly. And then we optimize our batteries against that price in a new way as well, which we'll go through today. So I guess the question really is, why are people that bothered about intraday prices in the first place? So where I was talking about how forecasts can change things, it means that intraday prices are a lot more volatile than day-ahead prices. And we just saw an example of that in Shaniya's section. And this provides that additional arbitrage opportunity, which gives you that revenue uplift. So the plot here I'm showing is the actual prices in both the day ahead and the intraday continuous market in the last week of December in 2024. And then what's coming out of our model for these intraday prices, and indeed our model for the day ahead prices in the first week of 2025. And you can see the lighter pink line here, which is the intraday price, is often higher or lower than that day ahead price. And that gives you this arbitrage opportunity, which you can trade your batteries flexibility in. It's also showing that our model prices aren't too dissimilar to what we saw in reality, which is always quite comforting to see. So in looking at the data, if you can have the next slide, we've also noticed quite a significant change in the intraday markets over the last few years. So this plot here is showing the difference between the day ahead price and the intraday price in each half hour in each of these different years. So we can see there's a really wide spread in prices in 2022. And this is, of course, when we had the energy crisis. We were at the peak of scarcity on the system, which meant that very often the intraday price was quite different to the day ahead price. And this, of course, gives you a big opportunity for if you're able to take advantage of those price differences. If we fast forward to 2024, that difference is much smaller. The distribution is much narrower. And that means that volatility has fallen. More often in 2024, the day ahead price was similar to the intraday price. And why this matters is if you are using something like a percentage uplift on your revenues to account for your intraday revenues going forward, which is based on some historic analysis, which may be a little bit old, you could overestimate your intraday revenues. So if we go on to the next slide, which is looking at how we are building an intraday price forecast. It might seem a little bit mad to do out to 2050, but we've had a stab of it anyway. And we're using a fundamentals approach. So this is an example of a generation stack for the day. So there's lots of different generation types in the system, which you can see in the legend here above in the small text. I wouldn't worry too much about those, but I've picked out a couple of the generation types just for demonstrating how those things can change from the day ahead as we go into the delivery day. So we've got some solar and some wind in the green and in the blue. So this is what I think today my generation stack is going to be for tomorrow. And I have a demand forecast, I have a solar forecast, a wind forecast, and that gives me essentially a price forecast for tomorrow as I think things stand today. If I go forward to the next slide, you can see how that generation stack can change as we go into the delivery day. And this is actually using all of the outturn values for solar and for wind and for thermal outages. If we use the first day of thermal plant outages in the intraday price and a couple of other minor things. And you can see how the generation stack evolves. If we just flick backwards and forwards, we're really just talking about going from the day ahead period into the delivery period and how things change over that time. And of course, it gives us a different price signal. So this is how we have modeled the intraday price. So if we look at how that model of intraday price compares with reality across 2024, we can see that we're not doing too badly. The back test of 2024 coming out of our model lines up pretty well with the kind of volatility that we saw across last year. So the next question is then, how do we use these prices in order to optimize a battery? So I mentioned earlier that it's quite a complex dynamic world in intraday trading, where there are multiple optimizations through a delivery day. So this box here is trying to demonstrate what it's like in reality. We have the day ahead market, day ahead hourly wholesale market closing at 10 a.m. the day before when the results were announced. And then we have dynamic frequency response auctions in the afternoon. So by sort of mid-afternoon, late afternoon, you should know what your day ahead positions are. And then you move into the delivery day. And then an intraday trading window will open up, as I said, typically about 1 to 4 hours out from delivery, although trades can be placed maybe 18 hours beforehand in some cases. But most of the volume, most of the trading is done relatively close to that delivery window and up to 20 minutes beforehand. So how can we model this kind of really dynamic picture using a series of optimizations in a long-term forecast? So what we do is we crank out a linear program and build a whole load of optimizations with rolling windows of intraday prices to try and imitate what's happening in reality. So we have one optimization which happens after all those day ahead auctions have closed. So that could be at, say, 6 p.m. the day before delivery day. And then we have multiple optimizations which we run through that delivery day, where we learn more about what's happening in the day ahead markets as we move through time. So if we scroll on to the next slide, we go into this in a little bit more detail. So my delivery day -1, that day ahead picture represented by these blue boxes. That's my first optimization, and that locks in my day ahead position. And so, for example, if I've got frequency response contracts in there, I can't change those frequency response contracts in the intraday markets because they are locked in. I've already sold that volume and I'm not able to get out of that position. But then we move into the delivery day. And the first 2 hours of prices, we now learn about what's happening in the intraday markets. So I'm able to re-optimize position, my day ahead position. If I've got any headroom or footroom spare to take advantage of any arbitrage opportunities in those first 2 hours. So here that's between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. And then that gets locked in. And I run a subsequent optimization for the next 2 hour period as I learn more about what's happening in the intraday market. And this repeats throughout the rest of the day. So in the end, I end up running 13 different optimizations across this delivery window as I learn more about what's happening in the next few hours, and that gets reinforced through those intraday markets. And the reason we've chosen a 2 hour rolling window here is because actually the majority of the volume in the intraday markets is placed 2 hours before delivery. So trying to be as accurate as possible and not actually over-egging the revenues that you might get out of that. If you assume that you know what's going to happen 12 hours ahead of time, you're probably going to overestimate your ability to optimize in real time. So we thought 2 hours was a good compromise. So what does this actually look like in practice? So this plot here, I've got both the day ahead price and the intraday price across one 24-hour period. And you can see in the morning here, so when I've got in my morning demand uptake, a price opportunity, an arbitrage opportunity opens up between the day ahead and the intraday market. Perhaps demand is slightly later than it was originally forecast. So how does my battery respond to that situation? So if I overlay now the charge and discharge, or the buy and the sell actions of a 50 megawatt battery, I've bought cheap power overnight, and then I'm wanting to discharge that power in that morning peak. So originally I had placed a sell order in the day ahead market, and at around about 8 a.m, I think that is, I'm actually going to sell that back within buy it back rather, within the intraday market. And there's a price difference there, so I make a profit. And now I've got more energy within my battery, which I can actually sell later on at the end of the morning peak at the higher intraday price. So I've been able to take advantage of that fairly short in terms of time. It's over a few hours. There's that arbitrage opportunity, and it's actually boosted my day ahead only revenues by about 11%. So what does that look like in terms of revenue uplifts over the forecast horizon, that kind of strategy? So this plot here is showing as a percent how much more money I get from intraday trading as opposed to day ahead trading alone. So in 22 and 23, those really kind of volatile years that we saw at the beginning, the uplift was about 35% using this optimization strategy. It dropped in 2024 because we saw that prices were actually much flatter. And we think that that is going to grow over time, that revenue uplift, back up to kind of that 35%-ish figure by about 2030. And that's really because we're going to get more and more renewables coming online. And that means there'll be more and more forecast error, which kind of comes through in the markets as intraday price volatility. After 2031, we're very often in the short run marginal cost of wind. So actually, even though you've got more and more renewables coming online with their associated forecast error, the uplift doesn't change a huge amount. Great, so that is it for the intraday trading section. Please do put any questions in the Q&A and we'll try and get to them at the end, or the team will address them now. But I'm just going to mention quickly what else we have changed within the forecast this quarter. So number one is we have updated the commodity prices. So gas prices have actually gone up quite a lot in the last 3 months. They've gone up by about 11%. The impact of that reduces over the next 4 years as we, the tail wagging the dog, dog wagging the tail. So yeah, the impact of this for battery spreads is that they go up. Gas often sets the price at peak, which is obviously what batteries are pricing against. So this has the impact of increasing batteries. It's good for our revenues. The next thing we've updated is our nuclear capacity build out. There's been a few announcements in the last few months about extended retirements to some of the nuclear plants that are online. The result of this is that we get as much as 2.4 gigawatts more nuclear capacity in 2028. That has the effect of slightly less scarcity at peak times when the system is short. However, we also get a bit more negative pricing when it's very windy because we have more baseload that we can't turn off on the system. The other impacts that we've seen this quarter is our BESS capacity has changed ever so slightly. We've got a little bit more BESS in the mid 2030s, and the CCS capacity is a little bit flatter in the short term, but overall not too different between version 3.2 and 3.3 there. And finally, I guess the money slide, what is actually going to be the impact on the battery revenues that we are seeing? So we've got a short-term view here of the next 4 years. And this is for a 2-hour battery doing 2 cycles a day in East Midlands. So the short-term revenues are up about 5% over the next 4 years, and that's really driven by that increased gas price. The increased gas price increases both the spreads we see in wholesale markets and in the balancing mechanism. And that, 10% difference in gas price translates at about 5% higher revenues in the battery revenues. And that's it for forecast updates, apart from one quite exciting change we have is that if you are running a standard custom run on the Modo terminal, that can now be ready within 5 minutes. So submit your custom run, go and make a cup of tea, come back, and your results of your revenue curve should be ready and waiting for you.
Superb. Thanks, Robyn. So my job is to talk about a few things that might change that picture. And so I'm going to run through 2 things. One is on CP30, which is Clean Power 2030, and I'm going to talk about long duration storage as well. But first to CP30. So this is effectively a plan to overhaul the build out of renewable and flexible capacity within GB. And what you can see on screen here is kind of Modo's central projection of renewable growth. And so we think this is going to be pretty rapid out until 2030. You can see that in kind of the pink columns. Then you've got FES range, which is slightly above that. And if you then add into this build out program, you also have you've got the flex and the dispatch options from CP30, which then go even higher. So effectively more than doubling the renewable capacity added to the system out until 2030, which if delivered is an enormous increase in terms of the renewable capacity on the system. So what does that actually do? So if you add a lot of renewable capacity and demand doesn't necessarily keep pace with it, that changes power prices. So here we can see the average power price change, where we have a falling power price in every year from 25 through to 30. But just taking a look at 2028, we have that power price falling by £16 per megawatt hour. The good news for storage, though, is that what's really happening here is more renewables on the system is keeping that kind of charging price low or negative. But when we still have those periods of high demand during a day, you still have to rely on gas-fired generation. And that is where you essentially get your price spread being set. And so even though we add lots more renewables to the system, the spreads actually look better in the world where CP30 is pursued and you have that more aggressive rollout of renewables. So potentially good news if we can hit some of those renewable targets within CP30. It also is influencing the SSEP, which is the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan. And a few terms within this. So just as preparation for the next slide. So there's something called the full queue, and that is referring to transmission or distribution projects which are either connected or planned to connect prior to 2030. We have the low case, which are projects that are kind of effectively ready. So they meet a gate 2 criteria before 2030. So we think that they might or they are able to come through. And then we have something called the CP30 max capacity, which is the highest projected capacity for each technology published in the CP30 action plan. And really what I'm hoping to show you here is that when you look at these maps of GB, what you're seeing is that you've got the low case and the full queue. So remember, the low case was everything we thought could be ready by 2030, and the full queue was effectively everything that is in the queue up until 2030. And they're versus the CP30 max, which is the plan within Clean Power 2030. What we're seeing in these transmission capacities is that in both the low case and the full queue, we have a serious overcapacity in the queue. So you're seeing kind of the size of the queue versus that CP30 number. And so, for example, in North Scotland, the CP30 max says we need 1.9 gigs. The full queue has 4.9 gigs in it. And so as a percentage, we've got 257% of capacity in North Scotland. I think that the kind of key takeaway for me on this is that if you're, say, an asset in South Scotland, you're looking at something like 600% overcapacity for transmission connected battery storage projects. And so even if the numbers are adding up and you're getting a good IRR for your project, you actually might not get selected as kind of as a project to be delivered by the time 2030 comes. And so you might get bumped out to sort of post 2030 connection date. So even if all of the revenues add up, you still might get bumped. The same is true on the distribution side. And so here you can see the low case and the full queue for the distribution network. Lots of alarming red on there. This maybe is quite alarmist, but there's, so in some cases you have an overcapacity of 500% versus those CP30 maxes. So one thing to look out for your investment cases is just what CP30 might be doing to when your assets are actually able to connect.
And I should jump in.
Yeah.
We're going to look at this in a lot more detail in the next quarter as part of the roadmap for next time's webinar.
Absolutely. And then onto the other thing that's currently changing or currently up for debate is long duration energy storage. And so here we are talking about adding long duration storage to the network. Just to kind of talk through some of the basics of this. So here we have a chart showing the capex of storage. On the y-axis, you've got the cost, and on the x-axis, you've got the duration of the storage we're considering. If you look at the left-hand side of this chart, it says, well, the capex is significantly lower for BESS for 2 hours. And so if you're trying to build out 2-hour storage, you build out BESS. On the right-hand side, if you're building a 20-hour duration, then you probably want to build pumped storage. The tricky part is where does it tip over? And so where do you kind of move from BESS to pumped storage? In this case, in 2024's costs for BESS, you probably do that around 6 hours. If you move forward to 2030, this is probably around 10 hours. And so effectively what we're seeing is if you're trying to get the lowest cost to consumer for battery storage or for all types of storage, kind of where you put that number on long duration storage really matters. And so one of the things that's being looked at by Ofgem is the potential to move from, say, 6-hour storage to, say, 10-hour storage. We'll wait and see what happens. Obviously, also, if you have a 6-hour or a 4-hour storage unit, you could run that as a 10-hour storage system if you wanted to. Now, what does this mean for the system? So on this chart, you can see unlevered IRRs, which essentially the returns of battery storage projects. And towards the top, you've got 2-hour and 4-hour systems. Those give you the best IRRs. And so they're the thing that most investors will try and build out because investors are trying to get those best IRRs. If, let's say, we put a 10% hurdle rate on there, then most people will build out those 2-hour systems. If, however, under an LDES cap and floor scheme, you can only build out 6-hour projects, then you have to take off those 2- and 4-hour systems, and you can see your, say, 6-hour system is the next best system. Now, what investors will do is they will look for the biggest difference between the hurdle rate, which is what they need to proceed their project, and the IRR that their model will call out. And so If we turn this into capacities by 2050, it looks something like this. So on the here in the central case, we've got 2 and 4 hour systems being built out, with very limited 6 hour systems being added to the system. But if we bring in the cap and floor, which gives more revenue certainty to the projects, which gives a lower hurdle rate, we might then see a lot of 6 hour BESS being added to the system. Now, the kind of the key thing to take away from this is none of this is kind of set in stone. So the design of the cap and floor scheme could be tweaked. The duration of the cap and floor scheme could be tweaked. And so this could look very different, but also it could look a lot like this. So something that we're going to be looking out for a lot during 2025 to see what is actually going to be the final version of this design. And with that said, we're going to move on to Q&A.
Awesome. So we've had quite a few questions come in, which we are going to answer now. There's been some on the second section, which I will leave to you.
Okay.
But I'll take some of the intraday trading questions from, first of all, from Sam. How have forecasting errors been modelled to arrive at e.g. differences in wind or solar forecasts at day ahead versus intraday? So we've got a slightly different method for the wind and the solar, and indeed for the demand. So for solar and demand, we use some National Grid data sets. They publish the day ahead forecast and the outturn values, and we use the difference between those in historic data, and then have a way of ranking how good a forecast is on a depending on how sunny or how windy it is, and then apply that to our weather year in order to get the solar forecast errors. For the wind, the day ahead forecasts for the national wind figures from Elexon are less reliable. So we use a number of individual wind sites and look at their expected outturn, which is given by things like their physical notification versus their metered output. And that gives us about a 15% error-ish on wind. And for demand, again, it's using the difference between the projected demand at day ahead, which is published by National Grid, and the actual demand. But yeah, we use this system of ranking for the renewable forecast errors, and we do it on a monthly basis, and there's some detail on it on the methodology. But essentially, you find that if it's very sunny or really not very sunny, the errors are smaller. And similarly, if it's really windy or not very windy, the errors are smaller. And it's kind of the mid-windy or mid-sunny days where your forecast errors can be higher. So you need to be careful about how you use historic data on errors, pushing that forward. And the other thing you need to be really careful about, which is one of the most difficult things, is preserving the autocorrelation. So if I'm wrong about how windy I think it's going to be in the morning, likelihood is I'm also going to be wrong in the same direction, i.e. I thought it was going to be windier than it is in the morning. It's probably still windier than it is in the afternoon. So preserving that kind of autocorrelation on the errors is really important. So I think that answers both Sam and Lewis's question. Coming on to Maria's question, what cycling assumption has Modo used for forecasting day ahead and intraday to capture the uplift in revenues? So within our run library and on custom runs, users can put in a desired cycling limit per day. So you might want 1 cycle a day or 2 cycles a day or whatever it could be. Those are all respected in our day ahead and intraday modelling. So we only allow it to cycle in intraday up to that cycling limit. And then one further question from Claudia, how do you model cannibalization due to increased BESS or long duration energy storage participating in arbitrage? So the way that we build our supply stacks is to look at how the actions of the fleet of storage compress spreads. And obviously, the more storage you have online, the more your spreads are compressed because of the actions of that fleet. So we have like a step within our fundamentals model, which looks exactly at that. And the spreads get compressed with the more the bigger the fleet of storage online. And also electric vehicles and heat pump demand impacted as well as pumped hydro.
So yes, we've got a question from Robyn. Where do other technologies such as LAES or synchronous condensers and others fall into the LDES competitive landscape? So yeah, really interesting question. Synchronous condensers, synchronous compensators, that's actually a little bit outside of how most batteries will earn their revenues. If you want to find out more about that, actually, really good episode of Transmission today with Guy Nicholson from Statcraft, who is building some of the synchronous compensators and knows exactly how the stability pathfinders work. That is on Transmission, so do check it out. The question on liquid air energy storage, it really depends on how they deliver. So if we can start to see evidence of those technologies delivering and operating as we expect them to, we will continue to add more of those capacities into the forecast. At the moment, we have some, but we are still kind of waiting for those technologies to prove their kind of commercial viability. Then we've got, after how many charging and discharge cycles would a BESS system fail to give projected returns? In most of our build out, the way that when we model each half an hour out until 2050, and then we dispatch technologies against it, we only build out those that are continuing to give an IRR above a hurdle rate. And so there are some points when we start to get slower build out of batteries, but within our forecasting, we don't get periods where BESS fails to give an investable return in terms of getting over those hurdle rates. So we see a continued build out of batteries. But yeah, you could absolutely have that circumstance happening within the forecasting. Julio, hi Julio. What's your interpretation of why the transmission infrastructure versus CP30 is still green in the north with the south of? Yeah, okay. So those CP30 numbers, particularly in places like the low case, they were looking for responses to a request for information about projects that were effectively ready to build by 2030. So it is it is something which is might not be a completely exhaustive set of information. And so it might be the case that we have some projects that will be there that aren't yet in that plan, and therefore, even though it appears green, it wasn't necessarily green. We also have seen quite a lot of batteries focus on the south of Scotland because of the B6 boundary. That is a particularly congested part of the UK network, and where there is congestion, there's potentially need to kind of use batteries to either charge or discharge. And so a lot of people have sited in those regions, and they have been able to get plans to get connected in those regions. And so that's why there's quite strong overcapacity for transmission projects in the south of Scotland. Do you want to say?
Yeah, it's just disappeared. It's obviously been answered backstage. What is your view on the readiness of, from Katie, other non-pumped hydro types of LDES for utility scale implementation? Do you see these cannibalizing BESS revenues in the medium term? Yeah. It's kind of comes back to what you were just saying about the commercial readiness of those other kinds of long duration energy storage technologies. We do model them, and we use some of the numbers from the FES for these other types of storage. But in terms of in our techno-economic model, where we actually feel that things are dictated by economics rather than by things like subsidies, batteries are the only thing we model as following kind of market-driven economics. They're a very established technology. They're commercially viable. We now have 5 gigawatts, which are insured, financed, gone through FID.
Yeah. All
of that stuff, which isn't necessarily applicable to other types of long-duration energy storage technologies. It's a huge leap to go from a lab, for a kilowatt scale system, or even a half a meg scale system, up to a 50 megawatt plus.
Yeah.
And it takes 10 years to build pump hydro.
Yeah.
So maybe in the medium term probably yes is the answer.
Yeah, you've definitely heard me talk about this before in terms of like these kind of powers of 10. So the building like a 10 kilowatt to 100 kilowatt system takes significant growth in terms of what you can actually build within a factory. 100 kilowatts to a megawatt, again, you're starting to move from stuff that's maybe in an R&D lab to something which you can actually test. 1 megawatt to 10 megawatts means you're probably putting in something like 5 or 10 million. You're starting to get to serious money being raised. 10 megawatts to 100 megawatts, you're probably need to get some sort of government intervention, government support to get that built. 100 megawatts to a gigawatt, you're talking about a seriously commercially viable tech. And so I think what I would say for those kind of new technologies coming through is just look and see what's been delivered so far. That will give you a really good steer on how commercially viable the tech is. And that's definitely what we look for.
Sorry, there's lots of questions here coming in. How does the Modo forecast treat co-located batteries versus standalone? Is there functionality to forecast both? Yes, we do co-located runs via custom runs. So if you have a co-located site, the more standard is, of course, with solar, but we can also forecast co-located wind. Do get in touch.
Yeah.
As BESS capacity increases, do you see a risk of underutilized capacity due to lack of arbitrage opportunities? This comes back to our techno-economic build out. We require a hurdle rate, which is actually 10% to build a battery within our capacity build out. So while some of those batteries might have a slightly lower hurdle rate and some of them might be higher, we don't include anything that's not kind of commercially viable, which means that there is the arbitrage opportunity is there. We have such a growth of renewables and a fairly strong demand growth as well, that we expect there to be enough arbitrage opportunities to be able to maintain that kind of fleet size.
Then that's the critical thing, right? So this concept of underutilized capacity is a bit of an odd, is not necessarily the right way of thinking about it, in terms of you're trying to get to a financial return that rewards investors and gives you the IRR that's above a hurdle rate. When we get out into late 2030s, early 2040s, we have big periods where, say, wind is really strong. We might have 3 days where the battery doesn't necessarily cycle. That would kind of appear to be underutilized capacity, but provided that asset actually makes enough returns throughout the course of the rest of the year, it doesn't really matter if the battery doesn't run for those 3 days. So yeah, it's a really interesting concept. But yeah, we don't worry too much about those 3 days, provided they're making investable returns. A question from Ollie. What's Ollie's question?
Ollie, what assumptions are you using for Tenuos? Does this change over time, particularly given some of the modifications being assessed? So at the moment, we model both transmission and distribution Tenuos, and they are using the 5-year forecast from National Grid. We assume that batteries will be able to take advantage of those triad periods, and it's slightly different depending on whether you're transmission or distribution, which costs you get, like whether a triad is actually applicable to you. And they obviously change where you are in the country. And we use historic data from last year, actually, of how well batteries have actually responded to triads. So I think in some of the early versions of the forecast, we were assuming they were going to get all of a triad revenue, whereas now, we've observed in reality that they don't always do that. But yeah, we're keeping an eye on those modifications as they evolve, and we'll incorporate them in due course.
And I think if we did curveballs for the year to come and didn't talk about REMA and national pricing and zonal pricing, this question kind of rolls into it, because if you do move to a zonal system, then that asks the question of how you want Tenuos to impact where people will choose to invest and build. So yeah, I'm not going to sort of comment on that more, but effectively to say, if we do see a decision that moves us towards a zonal system, then assumptions around Tenuos will also need to be changed on the back of that regulatory change.
I think we will do, given the time, one final question from John. What signals the market should guide BESS and LDES to not compete with each other, but to collaborate? I.e. BESS mainly dealing with short duration events and long DES.
Yeah.
LDES with longer duration.
Yeah, this is really interesting, because it's funny that they've received certain names, right? That one's called short and one's called long. In reality, that's pretty irrelevant. They're both just storage technologies, and they will both get involved and charge when prices are low and discharge when prices are high. I really don't see there really shouldn't be a definition that one should deal with certain types and one should deal with other types. They absolutely will both work on periods of under generation or over generation. So I think they will already be collaborating, and they will collaborate based on market price. There doesn't need to be any kind of dictated definitions of where they can play.
Great.
Superb. Okay, Well, brilliant. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Please do send in any extra questions. We'd love to get them in and love to help you out. And if you have any extra interest in the way the forecasting works, please take a look at the forecasting methodology on the Modo terminal, and we'll see you next time.